At exactly 5 a.m., my phone vibrated on the nightstand, pulling me out of a deep sleep. The screen lit up with my wife Rachel's name. Her message was short, almost careless. Something came up. I'll explain soon. Relax. I stared at those words for several seconds. Normally, I would have called immediately, worried that something terrible had happened. But this wasn't the first mysterious message I'd received over the past few months. There had been late nights, unexplained schedule changes, and conversations that ended with, "You're overthinking everything." This time, I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I simply typed one sentence. No need to explain. Stay with him. You're single now. I pressed send, placed my phone face down, and quietly walked into the kitchen to make coffee. Less than a minute later, my phone exploded with missed calls. Rachel called once, then again, then 6 more times. I ignored every one of them. 20 minutes later, loud pounding shook my front door. Through the window, I saw Rachel standing outside, still wearing the same clothes from the night before, desperately begging me to let her in. I didn't rush to the door. Instead, I stood quietly in the hallway, listening as Rachel repeatedly called my name. Between the knocking, she kept saying, "Please, you're misunderstanding everything." But I had heard similar promises before. Every time something seemed unusual, there was always another explanation waiting. I wasn't interested in another rushed excuse before sunrise. Finally, I unlocked the door but left the security chain in place. Rachel looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying. "Please let me explain," she pleaded. I calmly asked just one question. "Before you explain anything, where were you?" She immediately hesitated. That pause lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. I had learned something important over the years. Honest answers usually come quickly. Carefully constructed stories take time. Watching her search for the right words hurt more than anything she could have admitted. In that moment, I realized I wasn't waiting for proof anymore. I was waiting to see whether honesty would finally come before another excuse. Rachel finally sat down on the front steps, realizing I wasn't going to open the door until we spoke honestly. She admitted that she hadn't been where she originally claimed. She insisted nothing had happened that would destroy our marriage, but she also acknowledged that she chose to hide where she was because she knew I would ask difficult questions. I quietly replied, "The problem isn't only where you spent the night. It's that your first instinct was to keep me in the dark." Tears rolled down her face as she whispered, "I was afraid of your reaction." I shook my head. "You weren't afraid of my reaction. You were afraid of the truth." The neighborhood was still quiet as the sun slowly began to rise. We sat there in complete silence, realizing this conversation wasn't about one early morning text. It was about months of growing distance, unanswered questions, and trust that had slowly been disappearing long before that sunrise. A few minutes later, I invited Rachel inside, not because everything was suddenly okay, but because difficult conversations deserved calmness instead of chaos. She walked into the living room and immediately noticed a folder sitting neatly on the coffee table. She looked at it without touching it. "What's that?" she asked quietly. I answered honestly, "Information from a family lawyer. I requested it weeks ago." Her expression changed instantly. She realized my message, "Stay with him. You're single now," hadn't been written in the heat of the moment. It came after months of quietly questioning whether our marriage could survive without trust. Rachel admitted she never realized how serious things had become because I had stopped arguing. I explained that silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means someone has become exhausted from repeating the same conversations. That morning, neither of us could hide behind assumptions anymore. For the first time in a long while, we had no choice but to face reality together. Rachel slowly picked up the folder but couldn't bring herself to open it. Her hands were shaking. Through tears, she quietly asked, "When did you start thinking about leaving?" I looked at her honestly and answered, "Not because of one morning or one message. It started the day I realized I trusted your explanations more than your actions." She lowered her head, knowing exactly what I meant. Over the past year, every uncomfortable question had been answered with another excuse instead of a real conversation. I told her, a marriage doesn't usually fall apart overnight. It happens when small moments of dishonesty slowly replace openness. Rachel admitted she had convinced herself that hiding uncomfortable truths was easier than dealing with conflict. Instead, every secret had quietly pushed us further apart. Looking at the folder on the table, she finally understood that it wasn't a sudden decision. It was the result of months of silence, disappointment, and broken confidence that neither of us had truly addressed. The rest of that morning was filled with the most honest conversation we had shared in years. Rachel admitted that she had become emotionally distant long before that 5 a.m. text. Whenever problems appeared, she avoided discussing them because she believed difficult conversations would only make things worse. I also accepted responsibility for my own mistakes. There were times when I buried myself in work, assuming everything was fine simply because we weren't arguing. But I explained that avoiding conflict isn't the same as protecting a relationship. Healthy marriages survive difficult seasons through communication, not secrecy. We talked about the warning signs we had both ignored, the promises we failed to keep, and the growing emotional distance that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. For the first time, we weren't trying to prove who was right. We were trying to understand how we had reached a point where a single text message exposed so much pain. Over the following weeks, we agreed not to make life-changing decisions while emotions were still raw. We started counseling and committed ourselves to complete honesty, even when the truth was uncomfortable. The lawyer's folder stayed in my desk drawer, not forgotten, but no longer acting as a threat. Instead, it became a reminder of how close we had come to losing everything. Rachel understood that trust couldn't be rebuilt through emotional apologies alone. It would require consistency, accountability, and patience over time. I also realized that remaining silent to avoid arguments had allowed problems to grow instead of solving them. Whether our future led us toward rebuilding our marriage or respectfully choosing separate paths, we promised each other one thing. We would never again replace difficult conversations with comfortable lies. Looking back, Rachel's message. Something came up. I'll explain soon. Relax. Wasn't the moment our marriage ended. It was the moment the truth could no longer hide behind vague explanations. My reply. No need to explain. Stay with him. You're single now. Wasn't written out of anger alone. It reflected months of unanswered questions and growing emotional exhaustion. The sound of Rachel pounding on the front door 20 minutes later wasn't what changed everything. What changed everything was the conversation that followed, where excuses finally gave way to honesty. That experience taught me that trust is built through countless small choices made every day. When those choices begin to disappear, love alone may not be enough to keep a relationship strong. Sometimes the most important turning point in a marriage isn't the argument people remember. It's the quiet moment when two people finally stop pretending everything is okay and choose to face the truth together.